Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
So what's happened here is you've sent this letter to the Obama administration because you're concerned that as the Healthcare Reform Act gets implemented, that women's health services, which includes not just reproductive but a whole range of stuff, is going to be, the access to those services is going to be impacted, and we have seen that happen already in Massachusetts.
Exactly. So we know that federal legislation was passed, but now it passes to the Department of Health and Human Services for Secretary Sebelius to make decisions about regulations. And so the New York State Bipartisan Pro-Choice Legislative Caucus, which is now about 80 members strong, but 54 signed the letter. We sent a letter off to the Secretary Sebelius and other people below her, urging that the regulations that they put out guarantee and assure that national health care insurance coverage is going to include women's health, and make sure that the types of providers throughout the country that do provide mammograms, cervical cancer screening, contraceptive care, and women's health care are guaranteed to be included as providers in national health care. Because the truth is, if we don't recognize that they have to be included in the insurance that is offered under the national law and then floating down to health exchanges, these providers won't be there, which means in a huge number of counties, even in the state of New York, there will not be providers of fundamental women's health care. So this is a critical issue statewide.
Well, it's really two things are going on. It's sort of like an ongoing meta conversation about coverage for women and women's health services in general, which at the federal level, the Republicans generally have been trying to erode, for lack of a better term.
Absolutely.
Right. And then subsequently,
we see.
Go ahead.
Well, we're seeing almost every 2 weeks some new variation in Congress of trying to set the clock back on women's reproductive health under the rubric of having to decrease funding for certain kinds of programs or put limitations on certain kinds of providers. But it all sort of circles down to they're trying to challenge through federal law a woman's right to choose.
Right. But the problem is that the way that that actually manifests in real time, if you will, like down at the state level, is that if there is, say, a 70-day lag time for a person to get in to see their OBGYN, that they might have a delay in a pap smear that would determine whether or not they had cancerous cells, for example. It's not necessarily about getting an abortion.
No, exactly. In fact, the vast majority of health care services that are provided through women's family planning clinics, health care clinics, are in fact not abortions, but rather preventive care, primary care, screening for cancers, screening for sexually transmitted diseases, contraception, which of course prevents unwanted pregnancies. So under the illusion that they're just going after abortion providers, there are a significant number of congressional representatives in Washington trying to destroy an entire system of health care for women in this country.
So the way that this trickles down at the state level is that under health care reform, we're supposed to be setting up this health care exchange at the state level, or the feds are going to do it for us, is my understanding. Does the bill that the Senate has not yet taken up, because the Republicans control the chamber and are loath to do so at this time, does it include provisions that protect the kind of services that you're seeking to protect?
No, the bill that we hoped would pass the Senate before the end of session in June did not explicitly provide or prevent access to women's health care through certain kinds of providers. It was an assumption that in the state of New York we were going to ensure through a health care exchange that those types of services were available, and it exists under our state law. Our concern here is if the feds don't set the precedent through their regulations that these kinds of services absolutely can be covered through exchanges, then we have the dual problem of no mandate for New York State to follow those regulations in New York State. And what if we never get around to getting our law passed here and we default to whatever the federal government is ordering us to do? We need those protections in the federal regulations.
What is the latest? I mean, at this point, the Assembly has passed, it still seems the same. The Assembly has passed the health care bill, exchange bill. The Senate has not. And at this point, there is, unless I'm wrong, and correct me, there's no plan for the Senate to return prior to the start of the 2012 legislative session.
You and I are hearing the same thing, that the Senate Republicans have, quote, no reason they feel they need to come back to deal with legislation before the January 2012 session begins. I beg to differ. There is a time clock ticking about our ability to make an application to the federal government for an estimated $100 to $150 million of money that we could be eligible for to help us in setting up our health exchange, getting into the program sooner than later for people who are uninsured or underinsured. So every minute that we don't complete the assignment of passing a New York State health exchange bill, we are prevented from moving forward to draw down federal money and to get our system in place.
But the trouble is that if you did come back, there are a number of things that I think that the Democrats, at any rate, would try and be pushing, which is not something that the powers that be are very interested in seeing. For example, the millionaire's tax, which is scheduled to expire at the end of December. You would most likely, I mean, you would, right? You would push for it to be extended if you were in Albany in December or in November even.
Well, I actually think the good news about democracy is you're supposed to have debates about big issues such as a millionaire's tax or actually continuing the high-end earner supplement that we currently have in law. You're supposed to be a responsive and dynamic government to the changes in needs at the state level. We know our tax revenues are in fact below what we estimated. We know that when the super committee gets done with their assignment in Washington, which is happening literally as we speak, we're going to see a significant drop in federal revenue to the state of New York. The world is changing. The state legislature and the governor are supposed to be able to be responsive as the needs arise. I am very confident in saying there are new realities facing this state that were not the realities in June and should be addressed before January. Yep. So I would also argue the health exchange, some of the tax questions, if in fact the PEF contract is approved, my understanding is they will need legislation to complete that. We could get that done also. That's certainly a major issue for huge numbers of New Yorkers.
We have already heard from Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver that he's not going to accept any deeper cuts in education and health care. And of course, because of the way that you did the budget, you structured the budget, this one for 11-12, the governor has said that he will put in the increases in funding that you agreed on, slight increases in education and health care going forward. But of course, if in fact the financial picture worsens, it might be difficult to do that depending on how much money the state has. The Senate is now very closely divided. I don't know that they can pass a budget without significant support from the Senate Democrats. Will you also take a stand? You're the ranker on finance. Would you take a stand against more spending cuts after last year? Or this past year?
I think well, certainly it's way too early for me to even pretend to be speaking for my conference. I am very proud to be the ranking Democrat on the Finance Committee. We have not seen any new proposal by the governor, so I think it's early for me to hypothesize a response. I am telling you today I'm very worried about the revenue projections for next year. Last year the governor was optimistic that the economy would have turned around and that we would have, quote, plenty of revenue to deal with a budget as we had planned last year. Again, as you pointed out, health care and education ended up sort of being packaged as a 2-year budget.
Right.
But that assumed better economy, better numbers coming in from our revenue projections and from Washington. And of this date, both of those stories seem to be much worse than we thought they were going to be at the time.
Well, Senator,
so I think that we're going to have to face all of this, either starting this late fall or in winter when we get back up there.
Well, early budget talks, I think, are going to begin next month, if I'm not mistaken, and so I'm sure there'll be a clearer picture. In the meantime, I want to thank you, Senator Krueger, for being on the show and for taking the time for us. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.